Most friendships don't end with shouting. In fact, I don't think I can recall a friendship that's ended in a massive argument and never speaking again. And similarly, researchers in social psychology have done a number of studies on this and found consistently that adult friendships generally don't dissolve because of dramatic fights or shouting matches. We just think they do because we watch so much EastEnders. Instead, friendships break down because of the little things. Small offences left unresolved. Quiet resentments that slowly undermine the foundations. I've had friends over the years. I know it's hard to believe, but I have. Both inside and outside the church, where at a point in time there has been a clear and obvious calling of that person towards me. And sometimes I have no idea why that's happened, whether it was me or them, or if it's all in my own head. In other situations, I know exactly what I've done. I've said sorry, and it still might not be enough. Often, it's the small things that start to chip away at a friendship. Things like a comment that didn't need to be made that cuts a little too close to the bone. A confidence broken. Or maybe a conversation that really needs to happen that we don't quite get around to. And not all the time, but sometimes, these single events can cause irritation, which hardens into contempt. Two people who once shared conversations, laughter, faith, now pass each other with polite smiles and tight jaws. No one breaks a commandment. No one raises a hand or even necessarily their voice. And yet something is broken. Something gets lost because of anger. And Jesus says, in these moments, we may not have broken the commandment, you shall not murder. But we're nowhere near as far from it as we might like to think. That's the context of where we arrive this morning as we hear Jesus speaking to this gathering of people. He typically lures his audience into a false sense of security with a statement that would have had everyone nodding in agreement, not least because it's a statement most people are safe from. You have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. You can imagine the nods at this point. Oh yes, very important point, Jesus. To a group of people for whom this commandment is essentially meaningless. They follow the rules, well, the big ones anyway, and because of that, they feel very safe in this moment, knowing that the judgment Jesus is talking about here has no bearing on their lives whatsoever. But then, Jesus uses this device, which Jenny mentioned last week, that he uses 6 times in the Sermon on the Mount, which I think we can safely refer to as a good old spiritual ambush. There are 2 halves to this phrase. Firstly, you have heard it said. Generally, an Old Testament commandment which everyone agrees on, straightforward, the line in the sand that we all expect to see. When Jesus says this part, most people feel safe because it doesn't impact them. He takes the commandment we're comfortable with. In this case, you shall not murder. But then he pairs it with this second half of, but I say to you. And suddenly, he's raising the bar. And not by a little bit either. And suddenly, we're all in trouble. And nobody is comfortable or safe anymore, either on the day he spoke those words or today. And that's what Jesus does so often. He takes the law we thought we passed and shows us we'd actually only just started to even understand it. In fact, with that in mind, let's read that part in full again. You have heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now that's, all of a sudden, a lot more difficult to sit the right side of. Let's be honest, we're probably all on the wrong side of this one. Which is exactly the point. Jesus isn't trying to shame his audience or us. He's just trying to show how deep the problem really goes. I mean, personally, I don't struggle with anger at all. I just struggle with people existing in ways which I feel have been personally designed to test my ongoing sanctification. We've all been angry with someone else. Some of you are probably thinking of someone right now. If you are, please try not to look at them. But while we may not have used the exact words of "you fool," and I'm sure we've never literally used the word "raka," which just means shallow, stupid, vain, empty-headed, good for nothing, take your pick. We've certainly said things to people at times with some or all of those meanings. I read somewhere that if you want a good translation for raka, it's what you say under your breath when someone cuts you up on the motorway. I won't tell me mine if you don't tell me yours. Jesus here drags the commandment straight out of legalism, straight out of a courtroom, and directly into the heart. He takes it from somewhere over there, nowhere near us. Murder? What, me? Are you kidding me? Of course not. To a still small voice of, okay, but have you ever been really angry with someone for something so small and just not been able to let go of it? Again, that one's harder to shake. Let me be clear though. What Jesus isn't saying here is that to be angry is sinful in itself. Ephesians 4 nicely clears up the distinction for us, where it says, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." To feel angry, to feel wronged or hurt is perfectly reasonable. You are a person with emotions, and you are allowed to feel things and to accept that you feel that way. It's not a case of, the Bible tells me I must not be angry, and so we just shovel the emotion down and try not to feel anything. I promise you that approach will not go well for you. No. If you feel angry with something someone has done to you, that's not sinful. That's not a problem. Yet. Anger becomes sin when we refuse to let it go. When it hardens into contempt, and when we begin to reduce another person with our words and our thoughts. When we reject reconciliation and give hatred a tiny little foothold in our hearts. The law focused on the end behaviour. Do not kill. Do not commit an act of extreme violence towards another human being. But Jesus chooses to look at the starting point of anger, which ends in an act like that. He is saying that violence begins long before blood is shed. It begins in our hearts, in our imaginations, and here's the real problem with that. Every person we stay angry with is someone made in the image of God. Every person we dismiss is someone loved by God. And every person we quietly write off is someone Jesus died for. There's a tension you can't ignore. The more we hold someone in anger, the harder it becomes to truly love God. And that's exactly why Jesus goes on to speak about reconciliation, why making peace with others matters so much, with a statement which, both then and now, is completely revolutionary. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. In other words, stop the service. Someone in the middle of an act of devotion pauses what they are doing, leaves the temple, and goes and makes things right, then returns to offer their gift to God. That would have been really obvious and potentially really embarrassing. But Jesus is crystal clear on this point. God values reconciled relationships more than flawless rituals. That doesn't mean that worship isn't important, but it does mean that worship which chooses to ignore broken relationships is incomplete. Faith is not just vertical, between me and God, or you and God. It's deeply horizontal as well, between me and you, and you and you, and all of us together. Therefore, just as our relationship with God is essential to our lives as Christians, in the same way, so are our relationships with each other. And there's an interesting point here, because Jesus mentions brothers or sisters in both verses 22 and again in verse 23. Does that mean what he's talking about only relates to people inside the church, only to other Christians? In one way, yes, actually. Yes, it does. Jesus here is very specifically talking about people you are in community with. In our case, worship with, share faith with. And we'll see again next Sunday. But I'm not sure that makes the command any easier. If anything, it's probably easier to avoid people that you rarely see, and much harder to avoid the person who sits 2 rows behind you every week. I think Jesus begins where we have the least excuse, with our church community. But he doesn't stop there. If reconciliation matters this much with people we worship with, how much more does it matter beyond these 4 walls? The call begins with those closest to us, but it doesn't end there. Now, sometimes, I know, reconciliation isn't possible. Sometimes the other person may have died. They may not even speak to us. I want to be clear that Jesus isn't asking you to fix what it is outside of your power to fix. But he is asking you to examine what is happening in your own heart, to take responsibility where you can, and to choose the hard work of peace over the comfort of keeping distance. He is asking us to refuse to let anger become a way of life, a normal way of thinking for us. He wants us to deal with anger before it hardens us and changes us as individuals into people who are less and less in the image of a perfectly loving God. Finally, Jesus ends with a brief practical image. Come to terms quickly on the way to court. The point of everything we've heard today is that while it might not feel like it, there's urgency in these matters. Unresolved conflict does not stay neutral. It grows, it hardens, and it traps us. While not strictly from the Bible, I think there's a lot of truth in the saying, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So much of the impact is not on the other person, but on us, who become imprisoned. Not by what others have done to us, but by our own refusal to forgive or seek forgiveness. Jesus wants freedom for us. It was for freedom that Christ has set us free. So why on earth would we trap ourselves all over again with self-built walls of anger and hatred? I once carried a grudge for weeks. Every time I saw the person, I'd replay the moment in my head. How I was going to tell them how hurt I was, how let down I felt. So at last, I worked up the courage to confront them. And it was immediately apparent that they had no idea what I was talking about. Not a clue. And it completely took the wind out of my sails, cut my anger off at the knees. I realised in that moment how ridiculous it is to star in a courtroom drama that exists only in our imagination. Sometimes our resentments are so much bigger in our minds than they are in reality. And so the only thing I could do was I ended up apologising to them. I took a step towards reconciliation, and we went from there. But sometimes the steps God calls us to are far, far harder than that. Sometimes reconciliation asks everything of us. In fact, more than we feel we could possibly give. After the Second World War, a Dutch woman named Corrie ten Boom travelled through Europe speaking about forgiveness. She'd survived a Nazi concentration camp where her sister had died and she had endured hunger, humiliation and violence. She knew firsthand what hatred looked like. One evening, after speaking at a church in Munich, a man approached her. She recognised him immediately. He had been one of the cruelest guards at the camp. He didn't even recognise her. He spoke cheerfully about how wonderful it was to know that all sins are forgiven, and then he held out his hand. "Will you forgive me?" he said. Corrie later wrote that in that moment, everything in her rebelled. She remembered the cruelty, her sister's death, and the power that that man had once held over her. She said, not out loud, but in her head, she could not forgive him. Not in her feelings, not in her strength. But these words came to mind. Forgiveness is not something we feel our way into, but something we obey our way into. She prayed a simple prayer, "Jesus, help me." And she found herself reaching out her hand. As their hands met, she felt a warmth move through her arm and into her heart, a feeling she could not have created on her own. Forgiveness, she said, was not forgetting or pretending nothing had happened. It was not excusing evil, but it was releasing the right to hate, to be angry, and to stay angry. This is the kind of obedience Jesus calls us to, whether the wrong is imagined, as in my story, or unimaginably real, as in Corrie's. And it's only through him that it is possible. Jesus calls us to be a community where words are chosen carefully. Anger is faced honestly. Reconciliation matters more than keeping up appearances. Right relationships are part of our worship. Worship which flows from peace, peace with God and peace with one another. So these questions remain. Is there anyone I need to make peace with today? Have I been carrying any anger towards someone, either inside or outside the church? And what step towards reconciliation could God be asking of me? Before the next prayer, before the next song, how might each of us need to respond to that challenge?